This happened last night, about 1:15 midnight. I was in my bed trying to get to sleep when I suddenly heard a frantic knocking on my door. I walked out of my bedroom while the knocking continued on. I heard a woman whispering through my door, "Please, help me," along with crying. It was very faint though, almost inaudible. I looked out the peephole, only to see no one was there. No other doors were being knocked on either, only mine. This was already quite odd by itself, but I was on the 3rd floor of my complex. Why would someone walk all the way up to just my apartment if they were in such distress? Immediately, I took note of something odd sounding about this voice as well. I thought it must be a recording. If someone really needed help, wouldn't they be banging on everyone's door? I called the police immediately, and the dispatcher told me not to open the door no matter what. He asked if I had a weapon as well. I'd heard of this tactic before, albeit with a slightly different variation, that being a recording of a baby crying outside. It's just insane when thinking about the statistics. Stranger abductions usually result in murder. Just so sick to try and prey on people's empathy. Police drove by and I saw them using their spotlight to look throughout the entire complex. As of now though, no one was found out there. If by chance someone really was hurt, I hope they did find her. I've barely slept with all the possibilities of how this person found me, where they saw me, and when they followed me. Did they live in the same complex maybe? I'm 4'10" and live alone, and don't know many people in my area. No close family either. Had someone been watching me and known all this or something? It's just making me go crazy. Stay vigilant and don't fall for these sorts of tactics. This happened about a year ago. If I hadn't already heard of that baby recording thing, I may have actually opened the door. I don't know where I would be right now if I would have. Update. I've talked with the management to let them know what happened. As of right now, not a single other person reported anything similar happening, and nobody else heard that voice either. I'm gonna call the police again for an update too. I was redirected to another PD, but they weren't the ones who initially responded. I know it takes some time for reports to be filed, so I'm trying my best to be patient. I want to know if this has happened to anyone else. As far as it being a prank, I guess it could possibly be. I'd be more inclined to believe that though if it had happened to anybody else in the apartment complex. Maybe it had, but they hadn't said anything. This happened when I was in college. I was home for the summer working, and my boyfriend was also home for the summer living with his parents. They were about an hour and a half away. We finally had a rare day when neither of us needed to work, so we drove down to spend the entire day with me. We were saving for the coming school year, so we tried not to spend too much. That ended up meaning we ate lunch and dinner with my family at my house. We didn't get much alone time because of this. After dinner, we wanted to have some time to ourselves as a couple, so we decided to pick up some root beer floats at Sonic and drive out to a local state park where young couples like to hang out. We parked and walked out to one of the little covered picnic tables in the woods. While the parking lot itself was well lit, because of how thick the woods were, it was quite dark sitting at the picnic table. We'd hung out there late into the night before though, and it had always been perfectly safe. For some reason this time though, I felt really nervous sitting in the dark when another couple popped out of the woods just past where we were and started making out leaning up against each other at the other end of the table. We moved to my boyfriend's pickup. My boyfriend turned on the radio for some ambiance, and we sat in companionable silence attempting to eat our ice cream before too much of it melted. Due to the heat, we had the windows rolled down as well. After a while, the couple we'd seen burst out of the woods and left. Looking around, I realized something quite odd. Although there were normally at least half a dozen vehicles parked in this particular lot on any evening, we were the only vehicle in sight tonight. Even so, I didn't really think too much of it and continued to finish up my ice cream. All of a sudden out of nowhere though, I got the most horrifying feeling. You know that feeling when your hair immediately stands up on the back of your neck? You can feel someone looking at you when you thought you were alone. It was just like that, except so much worse. I had the distinct feeling I needed to run right now in the pit of my stomach. I started looking around the woods frantically and realized my boyfriend was also searching as well. I asked him if he also got a bad feeling. His reply was an emphatic hell yes. He started the truck and began to drive out of the park. Since we were facing into the park, he had to make a U-turn to turn around. As we passed back by the area where we'd been parked, a man stepped out of the edge of the woods. This happened on a Wednesday night. About a week later, someone found bodies in the woods just past where we'd been seated at the picnic table. When the crime was eventually solved, it came out a man was living in a hidden shack on the property. He was working as a maintenance worker for the park during the day and killed a couple on that Saturday night just after we left. The photo of the killer in the newspaper was the photo of the man we'd seen step out of the woods and watch us leave. This experience happened to my roommates and I in our second year of university. The city we went to school in was considered a very safe university town. The most we had heard of happening was some drunk morons doing typical drunk moron things. This was also the first time we were really living on our own. First-year residences are nice, but it's basically an extended summer camp rather than a typical living situation. The four of us girls lived in a nice townhouse that never once had a creepy vibe or weird neighbors or anything like that in the months we lived there. The only eerie part really was that every weekend we were the only people who actually stayed in the complex. All of our neighbors either went home or stayed elsewhere until returning Monday for classes. This was never something we had given a second thought to though, considering this was fairly normal for a university town, especially because our complex was only made up of 4 other townhouses. The complex itself was surrounded by walking trails and farm fields, which we all quite liked actually. It was like a nice quiet spot away from all the chaos of other college kids. There were a few farmhouses we could see from our backyard, but other than that, we were pretty secluded. The university was about a 20-minute bus ride away. That was never a big deal for any of us though, especially because the rent was far cheaper here than other places within walking distance. Being 5'6", I was the tallest by a considerable margin. I was also the only one of the entire group who had been in a handful of scary situations. Due to this, I was the only one who would ever remember to lock the doors, window, and garage before leaving or going to bed. My roommates all grew up in small, very safe towns, so it was very uncommon for them to lock their doors back at home. They were also incredibly kind and trusting to everyone, you know the type, never considering anyone has hidden bad intentions. The night in question started off very normally. We had planned on having a wine and movie night together. This was kind of a weekly tradition for us. We would pick some dumbass movie, get takeout, and get a little bit of a buzz going after a week of long classes and work. At this point, it was early November, so we had been doing this for several months with no issue. By 8:30ish, we had all settled on the couch in our living room and started up a comedy. With it being November, it was already completely dark outside now, other than our porch light you could see from the small window at the very top of our door. None of us were tall enough to actually see anything out of that window anyway, so we relied entirely on our peephole. It took a great deal of effort for me to convince my roommates to ever check the peephole before opening the door. This was a talk I had to have with them after one roommate had opened the door for our neighbor's very drunk friend, who proceeded to vomit all over everything. Not long after ordering some takeout, we heard a banging on our front door. My friend Jess made a joke about how the delivery guy must have taken a helicopter or something to get here this quickly, especially considering the place we ordered from was very close to campus. This was not a typical delivery guy's knock either. Between the few glasses of wine and carefree attitude of the night though, we didn't really pay it much mind. It was my roommate's turn to pay this week. I'll call her Meg for the purposes of the story. Out of the group, she was the smallest, less than 5 feet tall. She was also the most naive, trusting person I've ever met. She ran up to her room to grab her wallet. This took at most 30 seconds. During this time, the banging continued and was getting even more aggressive. I figured maybe it was cold or he had other shit to do, so we yelled at her to hurry up. The banging, though, continued to get harder and harder, and I started to feel a bit uneasy. When she came back down, I told her not to open the door just yet. Check the peephole before opening it, as she was usually the one to just open it up the most. She got to the door and tried to peek out the peephole, but she could barely reach it on a good day. When she said she couldn't see anything, my other roommate and I got up to help her. My second roommate, Jess, was kind of a funny gal. There are very few things she would not turn into a joke. She got to the door before I did and looked out the peephole. The person on the other side was still banging away. The way she turned to look at me, I instantly knew something was wrong. She looked confused, a look I had rarely ever seen on her, as she was very clever. Within a second, she went back to look. This time, she looked afraid. This made my stomach knot up. She was not a person to scare easily. "I think someone is covering the peephole," she whisper-shouted at us. This time, I looked out too, and yeah, something was covering up the peephole so we couldn't see outside. We could still see the porch light shining through the window at the top, so we knew it was not a case of being too dark to see what was going on outside. By now, our other roommate, who I'll call Annie, walked down the hall trying to find out what was going on. She was easily the drunkest of the 4 of us. Even sober though, she seemed to always think she was invincible. "What's your problem, guys? Open the door. The poor dude has his hands full already." Jess and I explained what was going on. That's when Jess was sober enough to ask Meg to check the website she had ordered our food on. Meg was so drunk she'd never even placed the order. She had selected our food but never finished the last step. The banging continued as the situation started to sink in. Anne was so drunk though, she still seemed to not grasp what was happening and went to go unlock the door. "Stop!" I snapped at her. Immediately I knew I had been too loud. For the first time, the person on the other side of the door spoke. "Ma'am, this is the police. Open the door now. We have some questions for you." That sobered me up right away. I looked over at Meg, who was already welling up and panicking, then at Jess, who had gone completely pale and was no help either. The banging was getting increasingly harder, to the point we could physically see the door banging in with each hit. Meg took Anne upstairs trying to calm each other down and check if there really was a police car parked outside. They made sure our windows were locked too. Though it was hard to do, there was a possible area to get onto part of our roof that made it possible to get to Anne's window. We heard a window slam, immediately knowing it had been Anne's. Being a bit of a thrill seeker, Anne had jumped out her window screen in order to sit on the roof and check out the situation. "Show me your badge and then we'll open the door," I yelled back. Instead of a response though, the man started to try and kick in the door. I told Jess to call the police and ask if they had an officer dispatched to our address. She was shaking so badly it was hard for her to dial. Now Meg had come back downstairs, sharing that there was no police car parked outside. Anne trailed behind her, standing on the stairs trying to get a look outside the window at the top of the door. At that moment, my blood ran cold. I just remembered the man at the other side of the door had said "we," not "I." Jess came to the same realization. She sprinted to our back door, a large sliding glass door, which she double-checked was locked. Thankfully, it was. She drew the curtains shut as well, trying to minimize the chance of them seeing in. Within just a minute, knocking started at our back door as well. Thank God she closed the curtains, because the idea of seeing whoever was doing this still gives me chills. "Uncover the peephole and show me your badge," I yelled again, trying to sound as intimidating as I could. We were met with sudden silence, so much worse than the previous banging. "What's your badge number at least? Prove to us that you're the police," I screamed, trying to keep my voice from breaking. The only response I got back was a very quiet, "I can't do that." Jess handed her phone off to Meg, who was sobbing now trying to speak to the dispatcher. The banging coming from both sides of the house must have been heard by them. They asked if someone was trying to break in. Meg frantically asked if the police had been sent yet. The answer, we all knew by now, was no. Meg babbled that at least 2 people were trying to get us to unlock the door by impersonating officers. The operator then told us police would be there in no more than 10 minutes. That made us all even more wary. We realized just how long 10 minutes really is. The door was now being hit so hard, I was worried it would actually break the frame. Jessie ran toward our back door, making me worry perhaps our kitchen window had been left open. Trying to think, I slammed a chair underneath the doorknob, hoping the door would hold now. Jessie came back to the front door, holding a kitchen knife and a fire extinguisher. We had nothing to really deter whoever wanted in. No prods and no backup until the real police showed up. It was not anything like they were used to. All of them had grown up having family as neighbors their entire life. If anything were happening, their uncles and grandfathers were at their front door in a minute flat. Now, the invincible farm girl attitude was long gone. Everyone was scared. There was only some wood and glass keeping these men out now. And with the force of the hits against the back door, I was worried the glass would break any moment. "Open the fucking door!" the man yelled at us, not even pretending to be police anymore. Then it got silent again. The only worse thing than what was happening in that moment was not knowing where the men were now. The idea of both men moving to the glass back door made me terrified. If they really wanted to, they could easily smash through that plate glass. After, there was no more knocking at the back door though. Within seconds, the front door was being slammed even harder. I was trying to wrap my mind around why they would leave the easiest entry point for a heavy wooden door. Then I realized the back door was visible by the main road. Whether they'd seen a car or heard us talking to the police, they were smart enough to move to the other entrance. Jess then said something I hadn't thought of at the moment. "I don't think they want to rob us, guys. There are houses all around us that are empty, so why did they come to the only house with the lights on?" My whole body went cold. I didn't have an answer. Meg started hyperventilating. The 3 of us stayed quiet for a minute, awful scenarios running through our minds. Anne moved back up the last steps and out of sight of us. The operator, who we'd forgotten was on speaker, spoke, which practically made me jump out of my skin. "The police are just 2 minutes away. They have their sirens turned off and the lights are on. You should see them very soon. Stay on the phone with me so I can confirm when they're outside for you." The men outside were starting to get desperate. The sound of glass suddenly shattering had me turning back to the back door. I was fully expecting someone to burst in. The door was still intact though. Instead, our porch light, the only thing illuminating our area, was suddenly put out. We put 2 and 2 together. They had destroyed the only way we would have been able to identify who was on the other side. "You fucking little whores." A voice we hadn't heard before suddenly shouted through the door as well. Much worse than the initial speaker. It was full of hate and venom. It scared me more than the other person. This person had a goal. I didn't like how this sounded. Up until this point, I could have possibly convinced myself they just wanted our things, but this voice made me understand they wanted us. To this day, I've never heard someone come close to that level of malice. It sounded like he hated us for some reason. Somehow, I wished the first man would speak again instead of this guy. Until now, I had done a half-decent job of hiding how scared I was, but that voice ruined my ability to stay stone-faced. If they got in now, there was nothing we would be able to do to stop them. Not me, not my friends. We would have been at their complete mercy. Jess had practically stopped breathing. It was like the oxygen had been sucked out of the air. It was so quiet, it sounded like a gunshot when we heard our mailbox open. Anne suddenly ran back down the stairs. "I see the sirens, guys. They're coming down the main road now," she whispered, hoping the men didn't hear. The same man spoke again, one more time, so slowly I thought he was almost done after each word. In that same awful voice, he read out a letter addressed to the 4 of us, one our neighbor must have put in the box today. She had planned a potluck for the next week. None of us had thought to check the mailbox after we had talked to her in the driveway this morning. Jess, Meg, Ann, and LP, huh? Those are nice names. I'll be back soon, girls. Then we'll have some real fun. Tears started rolling down my face. I hadn't realized I'd started crying. I knew he meant what he said. I tried to pull my mind out of that dark pit that sentence had sent it to. I was waiting, praying the police had surprised them and caught them, hoping they wouldn't ever get the chance to come back. The silence continued. None of us dared to speak, worried we wouldn't hear if they moved to another point of entry. Instead, the silence persisted for what felt like a lifetime. The operator was the one to break it, telling us the police were now out front. She told us to stay in the house while the police searched the area. That kind person stayed on the phone with us for several more minutes, while the police searched everywhere. Finally, the real officer showed their badge through the peephole before even knocking. They did their best not to scare us. The operator told us we had done well, and we were in good hands now. We opened the door to be met by two kind-looking, older officers who we let in. Glass shards covered our front stoop from our porch light. It looked like it had been ripped out of the wall and smashed on the concrete below. There were several cars out front of our previously quiet home. The headlights on all of them were shining down the street toward the walking trail. We spoke to the officers who took a report from us. They asked us to describe the night's events in detail. They asked us if we'd saw the men at all, and we explained how the people had been covered up and the light had been smashed before moving away from the door. The officers advised us to speak to our landlord about, at the very least, some security cameras. An older officer then closed the pad he had been writing in and looked up at us. He then spoke a phrase that made me understand how much danger we had been in. Look, if any of you were my daughters, I would have wanted the officer to tell her, if you can get out of your lease, do it right now. These people know where you all live, and now they know the response time for us, especially after telling you they would be back. After that, they asked if we had heard a vehicle, something I hadn't considered. We didn't hear any type of motor until the police arrived. Even when Meg and Ann had gone upstairs to look for a police car, they had seen no vehicles on the street at all. That meant the men had come from the walking path, which would explain how they left without passing the police on their way back to the main road. The older officer of the two had a look that told me he had an idea of what was going on. He looked sad, which was worse than if he had looked scared. I knew he had seen this kind of situation and far worse in the past. We pushed for an explanation, but were only told it had been an issue years ago in the area and did not elaborate past that point. The officer stood up, exchanged a glance I didn't understand how to read, and then spoke again. We'll have a cruiser parked in the driveway, as well as a plain car around back. They won't have the chance to try again anytime soon. They didn't catch the man in the 2 more weeks we lived there. We had a few creepy things happen, but nothing close to this. The reality was, they had never been caught, and they could return at any time. After this night, we spoke to our landlady, who was thankfully very incredible. She owned several more properties around the city, and when we explained what had happened, she let us move to a different apartment she owned closer to campus. She told us our safety was more important than making a couple extra $100. She even left that old house empty for many months in order to make sure cameras, better locks, and reinforced doors were installed. She didn't want the people who moved in next to have to deal with anything shady either. Thankfully, those guys never came back, and we were able to enjoy our new apartment without much worry. It's still so scary to me though. Make sure to always lock your doors and check who's there before opening them. When I was probably 13, my family and I were on our way home from a Wednesday night church service. My mom was in the driver's seat, and I was behind her in the back. My 5-year-old brother was in the middle, and my 10-year-old sister on his other side. We were just down the road from the church, but it was a country road and late at night. This meant there was no light, and no one else on the road either. We were just coming up to our turn, when all of a sudden, a car came swerving from our turning spot. This little car was taking the turn so fast, they came into our lane and almost slammed right into us. We swerved as they tried to get in their own lane before we collided. Unfortunately for them, they overcorrected. Their car flipped and landed on the driver's side door in the ditch. My mom, of course, hit the brakes and immediately jumped out of the car to go help whoever was in there. She got about 3 steps away from our car before she stopped dead in her tracks. My sister and I were just sitting there, our mouths hanging wide open and having no clue what to do. All I could think to myself was, this can't be happening. This kind of stuff only happens in the movies. But why wasn't my mom going to help this person now? It was summer, so we had our windows halfway down. I could hear a person yelling for help from inside. My mom started moving again to help them, but for some reason, she stopped again in the center of the road. Another car flew past us. This guy didn't hesitate to jump out and run to the crash to help. The man got to the car and started prying the passenger door open so the man inside could climb out. I could see my mom wanted to run and help, but it was like she was rooted to the spot. That good Samaritan that pulled up behind us was able to get the door popped open. The guy from inside crawled out and got into a frog-like crouching position on top of the car. At this point, my mom started shuffling back to our vehicle. When I looked back at the man, he had this crazy look on his face. He looked directly at our car and my mom as well. He launched himself off the top and started attacking the guy who was helping him. While that man was down, he turned and started sprinting for our car at the same time. My mom turned and made a run for it. He must have known he couldn't get there before my mom did because he changed directions and moved to grab the car behind us. My mom jumped in and locked our doors just as this man jumped into the empty driver's seat of that good Samaritan. He slammed on the gas before he'd even closed the door and almost hit us, taking off a second time. Next thing we know, the guy who was just carjacked ran up to my mom's window and started screaming and knocking on it. My mom was of course shaken and didn't want to roll down the window now. She settled for cracking it open just a bit so he could understand what the man was saying. He was yelling for us to call 911 because he'd left his phone in the car along with his girlfriend. Of course, my mom started searching for her phone. She was so frantic from what had just happened though, she couldn't seem to find it. I took a break from keeping my little brother and sister calm and dialed 911 on my own phone. While she was explaining what happened to the operator, we heard a woman screaming down the road. The man that was out our window took off running. A few minutes later, he came back with a severely scraped up woman in his arms that turned out to be his girlfriend. My mom unlocked the doors at this point and let the woman sit in the passenger seat while we waited together for the cops. The girlfriend told us he'd noticed her while he was speeding off and tried to attack her too. She managed to scratch his eye and punched him while trying to plead with him to stop the car. He kept on trying to attack her though. Finally, he rolled down the window and pushed her out while going 60. The cops finally showed up and talked to all of us to get our stories. While talking to one officer, he told my mom the man had apparently shot and killed the man behind some apartment complex. That's why he was driving so fast and trying to get away. When we finally got home, we were all told to just go to bed, but of course I wouldn't be able to sleep that night. I went downstairs to talk to my mom. I worked up the courage to ask her why she'd stopped running to the car when the other guy didn't. She told me she had such a strong feeling that she should stay in the car with us. It was almost like she could physically hear it. When she heard him start yelling for help, she wanted to go again, but just like last time, she got the overwhelming feeling something was wrong. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if my mom hadn't listened to that feeling. The man could have easily overpowered her and gotten to the car if she had been any further away. I should also mention that man was caught that night trying to steal a new car. He had already ditched the car he'd stolen from behind us, so the thing that really helped him get convicted was that woman fighting him off. She'd managed to grab the wrap off his head before being pushed out. She didn't even know she did because of adrenaline until the police arrived and she found it by where she was pushed. The man did go to jail, but I was never informed for how long or anything else. And honestly, I don't really care to ask.